Hey everybody, I'm back. So took a few days off, went to Vegas, had some fun, and we allowed Defender for CSPM to set in and allowed some of our changes to storage based upon recommendations that we got to set in. So let's go check out and see where our secure score is at. So our secure score went up from 61 to 69%. So that's a nice bump just from those two changes that we made to Azure Storage. So that's good. Um, our trend is looking upward here. As you can see, you just keep remediating these recommendations as you go. You start with high, you go to medium, and then, if you have time, you start knocking off some of the low ones. That's how you get, progressively better in terms of your security posture as reflected in the secure score, right? So the trend that we can see here is, we enabled and took a look at foundational cloud security posture management on the 22nd of April. Our secure score was 61% at that point. Then the next day we enabled Defender for CSPM, and we let that, kind of set in a little bit. And you can see, our secure score went up a little bit without doing much. The number of recommendations changed, and the number of resources that were being tracked also changed because we had enabled more capabilities against more Azure services, right? And today, here we are at 69%, so making some good progressive progress. However, we had a new high risk recommendation pop up, which we'll take a look at. Um, and we've got, the same, around the same number of medium risk recommendations. You can also see that the resource count has changed. So the longer we give Defender for CSPM and the various defenders time to kick in and discover things, these numbers will change. And it helps to kind of track them because you're just staring at numbers if you go in the portal, and you won't remember, the variance in some of these numbers. One good thing is that our unmonitored resources went down to zero, so it looks like the agent was deployed on those virtual machines. So let's see here. We'll minimize that, and let's go have a look in a little bit more detail. So if we go look at our security posture, we've got 1 high, 3 medium, 51 low risk recommendations. And the high risk recommendation has to do with SQL databases. So that's a new one that's popped up, and we're going to work on that one first because we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck by remediating that one. And then we have some medium risk recommendations for two different VMs, a Windows VM and a Linux VM in our environment, and then everything else is low. So um, what we'll do is we will focus on this high risk recommendation here. But before we do that, let's also go have a look at our inventory. And this is where you can see the changes in the number of resources. So we've got 28 resources that have been discovered by Defender, 15 of them in a quote unquote unhealthy state, right? But now we have 0 unmonitored resources because we had enabled Defender for Server. The monitoring agent got pushed out to, all 4 of the VMs in my environment. So that probably helped our secure score as well. Um, and so that's what the resources look like. So let's start looking at what we need to do to remediate that high risk recommendation. So if I go in here to explore your security posture again, and you look at the high risk recommendation here, we can find out more detail on what it actually means by clicking on it, right? So this resource is a Azure SQL Database logical server, and um, you can see the various types of techniques that could be used to attack it based upon the MITRE framework. But let's have a look at the actual findings. Okay, so there's 3 different findings associated with this recommendation, and the the most significant one from a severity perspective is that auditing should be enabled at the server level. So we should be able to get a nice bump just by doing that, and that doesn't require any changes to any application code. It won't break anything. It's just, essentially enabling auditing, right? So, okay, let's go open up a new tab here so we don't lose our view in Defender. And we're going to go enable auditing on this Azure SQL database. So I go into SQL servers. Here's my Azure SQL Database logical server. And if I click on that and I go down to the security section, you'll see this auditing capability here. And God, this is one of those easy ones. All I got to do is turn this thing on. And I need to choose where the auditing information goes. I already have a log analytics workspace, so we'll put it there. That's part of the sandbox. And there's our log analytics workspace. And I think that's all I need to do. I just click on save, and we should see that particular recommendation get remediated once Defender for SQL detects that we've made this change. So that's obviously going to take some time. It doesn't happen in real time. So if we go back and we look at some of these other recommendations, I've got a medium one here on this test database that we created in the sandbox. So if you click in on this, basically when you read this, it'll tell you that this rule will fire for any newly created database until you grant access to other roles. Basically, they want to encourage you not to use the DBO role, which is essentially equivalent to the SQL Server sysadmin role, right? Except at the database level. They don't want you using that for users or for applications. You should have, practicing the principle of least privilege. You should have security roles set up already to limit the things that people can do, as opposed to using DBO, which is essentially God of the database, right? So let's go look at remediating this one next. Going to pause and all right, one of the cool things about Defender for SQL is it will actually show you the queries it's using to make certain tests. So if we look at this medium severity recommendation, you'll see down here that there's an actual query that you can copy and run to test whether or not this recommendation has been mitigated or not. So you can't make these types of changes directly from the Azure portal. You need a proper administrative environment. So what I've done here is I've logged into our logical SQL server here. And you can see here's our test database. I've pasted that query in that we just saw there in Defender for SQL. And when I run that, I see that, I have a violation here. And basically, this is just checking to see if there's any other users or roles with access to the database other than DBO. And right now there isn't, so that's a violation, which is 1. If there's no violation, that'll come back as 0, right? So let's fix this. It's pretty easy to do. I'm going to go in here to security, and I'm going to add another login called user1. Your name, go with user1. And I will stick in a randomly generated password here since we're using SQL Server authentication. And let's run that. Okay, so we have a new login, user1. Now what we need to do is grant that user access to the database. So we need to grant that login user privileges in our database. So if I go into testDB, into security, into users, I'll say new user, and I get a little template where I can write the SQL command to create the user. So we'll create user 1 using that same login that we just created. And I'm not going to need a default schema. And I'm not going to add the user to any roles at this point, so I'll get rid of that. And let's run that query to see how that goes. Okay, cool. So we created a user in our database, and if we do a refresh here, we should see user 1 in here. Now let's go back and run that test query and see if that will fix our violation. And it did. Violations coming back 0 now. So Defender for SQL should, the next time it does a scan, should mark that particular recommendation as mitigated, and we should get a corresponding bump in our secure score, which we'll check next.